How you doing?
There you are. Dwayne, the stage is yours. Take it away.
Appreciate it. Let me just share my screen. Cool. Share. All right. Hopefully that came up. Great. And then also over here. All right. So thanks, Lorna, for the introduction. And thank you to everyone tuned in. I tried really hard to get the fonts as big as possible, but you still may need to full screen the slides like Lorna said earlier. So I promise you there's nothing interesting happening on my camera feed. So you can just go ahead and full screen that away if you'd like to. All right. So now I like doing talks because it gives me the opportunity to broadcast what I know about a thing at a particular time and hopefully get feedback from people with more experience on the topic and or questions from people new to it that test my knowledge and forces me to really understand the material. So now, because the web is always changing and getting more and more powerful, my topic today is web components, as I understand it, as of May 2020, AKA new framework, no problem. Now, sometimes before delving into a new topic, I think it's helpful to see who's using it. As you can see here, hopefully there are some logos that look familiar to you. So let's see how some of them are using web components. Up first, we have Twitter. Now, anytime that you've ever embedded a tweet, you've been using a web component. As you can see here with the tweet, along with the code used to render it, you see it says Twitter-widget. Now, that's not a normal thing that you come across every day. And so that's kind of how you can tell it's a web component. Up next, GitHub. Now, GitHub, all the little timestamps, like the time ago when since either a repo or a file or a folder was updated, you can see that for the repos, it's relative -time. And then for the actual folders and the files, it's time-ago. And so GitHub is on the web components train. Now, Google, they're very invested in web components, so much so that they actually created a web component framework that you can use to create sites, ads, and even emails. And so the way it works is that on the framework, you just put together the pieces of code in the places that you want them to show up, and they magically appear and work and function as you would think. So for example, if you want an accordion, you would just do amp-accordion, and there you go. There's also cards. There's a whole list of all sorts of components and things. So you can check that out. Keeping it on Google, another Google property, YouTube. YouTube, the website is full of web components. If you just view the source, you'll come across a lot of elements that start with either YT or YTD, as you can see some of it right here. So again, Google is very invested in web components. Now, Salesforce. Salesforce liked web components so much that they created their own developer tool to help people create web components. And with that, you can use it in your Salesforce applications, or just without the Salesforce application, in your own personal or work applications. It doesn't have to necessarily be with Salesforce, which is a really great thing with web components. You can use them anywhere because it's a web standard. And so the web understands it. So so you can see some of the different components that they've already pre-made for you that you can just use, which is another great thing about web components. And we'll talk about that later. Now, I kind of want to dive into a case study a little bit deeper for Electronic Arts and how they're using web components. EA is, or Electronic Arts, is one of the largest game companies with over 22 studios and 10,000 people in 30 locations all over the world. Now, needless to say, they release a lot of games, such as NBA Live, Star Wars, The Sims, Battlefield, etc. Now, in the beginning, the web team took the approach of designing and developing each game's website independently. So one site at a time. You can imagine this leads to a lack of coherent experience for users as they're browsing all of the games EA offers. It also was difficult for the designers and the developers working on the sites. They were spending 80% of their time on what they called commodity web, things such as the navigation, footers, and media galleries, instead of actually building custom experiences for each game. Now, to invert that ratio, the network design system was created, now, or NDS. With the NDS, they were able to take the commodity web components and add theming capabilities, the ability to integrate with any framework or language, support for their own microsite architecture, and we're able to kind of bundle everything, UI components as a package, and be able to deliver it as a user interface as a service. Now, you know who else may have been using web components? You. If you've ever used the video element, the audio element, or the details element, or any of the myriad of other HTML elements out there, I always found it fascinating. I don't know, I'm kind of a geek about the internet. And so just by putting a video tag with a source, you're able to get a full-fledged video player. Is that amazing to anybody else, or is it just me? Like, you have a play button and a pause button. There's a timer, the duration. We have a video, the volume control. We can make it full screen if we want. You can even pull up a menu there, all with just a video tag. And similarly, the audio element tag. You get the player, you get the player itself. You get, again, the buttons, duration, the timer. Now, this is like, it tells you how far along you are on the audio, and then even more volume controls and another menu. So that is amazing to me. And then now, personal favorite of mine, for anyone who's ever tried, to create their own drop downs or like accordion style things where you can show information easily, there's the details element. And as you can see, it has the arrow already built in. And if you want it, like, that is amazing. So that kind of was always fascinating to me, and to know that they're basically web components is great. So now, if that didn't blow your mind, wait till we have what's coming up next. Now, this is the model viewer. And for me, this is probably one of the best examples of showing how you can take something very complex and break it down to a more approachable and easier to use method. Because with a single HTML tag and some script tags, you can embed a 3D model without needing to know WebGL and or the WebXR device API. So if I were to pull up the website modelviewer.dev on my mobile phone, you have the option of being able to take the 3D model and place it in your real world through your camera, and it stays there. So you can walk around it. You can do zoom. You can go closer to it. It gets bigger, move away. It's kind of amazing. So if you ever get a chance to check it out, modelviewer.dev. Now, if you want to see some examples, because like I said, it's just the web. So here are some examples. Now is the model plain vanilla job. Look at this. I can rotate it. I can look at different angles. This, I don't know. This is amazing to me. I can zoom in, zoom out. This is awesome. There's also options. You can have like little hit points. So when you select a piece, like this is super fascinating to me. And it just shows the power of web components. Now, let's say you use certain frameworks or libraries, and you wanted to include a web component in it. So here's an example of a basic Angular app, straight out of the box, and it's using web components right here. So that's amazing. And for my React folks, here it is using React. And again, like just a very few things you need to change in order to get it to work. Because again, it's based on web standards. So your browser understands it. So you can use it with or without frameworks, which is kind of amazing. Now, if you want to see more examples, here's a link to GitHub from Mozilla that shows a bunch of different examples. And then there's also more at webcomponents.org. And now webcomponents.org is not only a place where you can find a list of web components, they're also a really good source for just information on web components in general. So it's a really good place to kind of get started. Now, so hopefully seeing who is using web components, how they're using it, and what can be created with web components now has you want to know how to create your own. So now, as I stated before, web components are built on web standards. And there's 3 APIs, low-level APIs, that come together to accomplish and create web components. So we have custom elements, shadow DOM, HTML templates. So let's start off with the custom elements. The custom elements API allows you to register a custom element on the page. So let's say there's some caveats with the custom elements. As you can see here, the first one, it must include a hyphen or a dash. It's also known as kebab case. And so, for example, my hyphen custom hyphen element. And now you can't have any single word elements, and that's due to we don't want to have any name clashes. So you wouldn't have a script custom element or an A or H1 kind of thing. So to prevent any name clashes, you have to put a hyphen in there. And it also works with branding a lot as well. So a lot of companies put their name in the beginning of their custom elements to kind of, help with branding. So there you go. Now with custom elements, there's a class object that helps define the behavior of your web component. And we'll see an example of that later, but that tells the browser what your web component can do. And then we can also determine which, if any, built-in elements the custom elements extends. For example, let's say you want to create my-awesome-button. You're able to extend the HTML button element so you get all the goodness of a button and then add your own little spice of sugary goodness on top of it. And the same thing for any other element. So if you want to do an HTML input element or anything like that. All right. Next, we have the shadow DOM. And now the shadow DOM facilitates a method to attach a separate DOM to an element. So when you're looking at a regular like DOM, which is document object model, let's say like your page source, what have you, what you're looking at the higher level is the light DOM. And then inside of your web component, you can attach another DOM that's outside of the light DOM inside of your web component that's known as the shadow DOM. And that sounds super mysterious and it's kind of awesome. And Paul Lewis put it really well when he said it helps contain the gross. So it provides encapsulation to keep the style, the structure, and behavior separate from the outside code or the light DOM. Now, it also allows for remapping of events that happen inside of your web component. Let's say a click happens inside of your web component. Now, that may not mean much to anything outside of the web component in the light DOM, but you're able to map it to something more meaningful that the light DOM can listen for. So it knows to react to something that happens. Now, next, we have the HTML templates API. Now, this creates a flexible template that will be inserted into the custom elements shadow DOM. So this is pretty cool. So what you're saying is, hey, I have this template, and you're telling the browser, hey, I need you to hold this for me. Don't worry about showing it yet. I will let you know when I need it and to show it. And so the template elements content is not immediately rendered. We define the HTML structure up front and then clone it when needed via JavaScript. And it's used to efficiently render HTML and update it when the user interacts with our web component. And then for more complex templates, because it's the web, things tend to get complex, it might be easier to use a library, framework, or some sort of tool. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. So let's get into a basic example. Now, I wrote this to kind of get everyone's feedback on who's the greatest group of all time, even though there's only really one correct answer. So let's say Backstreet Boys, they're still popular, right? Let's see, Backstreet Boys. Submit. Now, you're not seeing this because I'm just sharing the tab, but an alert dialog box popped up saying nope. And when I hit OK, then you get the verdict. And so, I guess they're okay. But notice, a few things to notice. Notice this is green because these are both H1s. So the little thinking face emoji, I guess what it's called. Notice that, as well as when I click the web component, it turned to red. All right. Now, let's go for the actual answer that everybody knows what it is, the correct answer. Outcast. Greatest group of all time. Submit. And now, again, a alert comes up saying, yep. Click OK. And then it changes there for the verdict. Now, notice that it didn't turn blue again. It's stayed red because it's the same web component. And only the information in the template changed. The actual web component stays the same. And we'll show that in some code coming up next. All right, so here's the HTML, pretty standard HTML, except what I have here in this red box. Now, normally, there isn't an HTML tag called goat-group, but we're creating it. And so since we made it a web component, the browser's like, oh, fine, I know what to do with this. And so as you can see, it has an attribute of guess, which we're setting to nothing right now. And then again, here is the thinking emoji face thing that you can put in, information in between your tags, and that goes into slots, which we'll see coming up. So here's the HTML, not so bad. Here's the CSS. And so if you notice, I set the font family to monospace. And if you take a look at the actual the application, the monoface also goes into the web component. Now, that's because I didn't set a font face for the web component. If I did, it would use the one that's in the web component. But I think they let it kind of leak through so that there's some consistency throughout your application, just in case you don't set one yourself. Same thing for the font size. And here again, I've set the H1, the color is green, which you can see here. And then these are just the other stylings for the input and the button elements. Okay. Now let's get into some JavaScript. Now, at the top, we have the light DOM stuff. So again, as with a lot of different JavaScript applications, you want to get references to different elements on your site so you can do things with them. So I'm getting a reference for the submit, for the input, for the submit button. And then, like I said, and I just want to keep repeating it, that your web component is just the same as any other HTML element that is on your page. And so you can get a reference to it the same exact way. And that's what I'm doing right here by getting the goat group element. Now I'm adding an event listener so that when the submit button has been clicked, I have a console log because I'm a big fan of console logs. And I set the attribute on the actual goat group element. Before it was guessed and it was set to nothing, to an empty space. But here I am setting it to the group submit input that the user put in, to the value. And then I just go ahead and clear out the input. And here I'm actually listening for the custom element that will be dispatched from the web components. So I named it guest because for me, in the outer code, guest means more to what I should be doing than click, because I could have multiple clicks. Which one do I actually need that has when the person guessed? And so that's what we have right there, listening to it on the window, and it's launching an alert, and with the detail that I send along in that custom event. Great. More JavaScript. So now here, we're actually creating the template. And I said before that you could actually put it in your HTML between template tags, but I'm a JavaScript developer and I get paid for every line of JavaScript I write. And so I'm just kidding. I just wanted to show another way of being able to create the template. And so as you can see here, creating a template here, and then I'm setting the insides of it, the inner HTML to my own template here. So here's the slot. And again, you can put information in between your tags or your custom element, and they go into the slot. And now you can have name slots. You can do a bunch of things. But for right now, everything just goes into the slot. And then here's the H1 that has the group's name. And then here's the verdict on whether you're right or wrong. All right, up next, more JavaScript. Hopefully you can see that I tried to get it as large as possible. But now here is where we're starting with the class. Remember the custom elements API requires a class so that it describes the behavior of our web component. And so we have the class, we're naming it goat group, and it extends the HTML element. Now, like I said before, you can have like an HTML input element, HTML video element, but the HTML element is like the base of the base class. All the other elements are based on the HTML element. So if you're not specifically targeting a certain native element like an input button or video, your best bet is probably to go with the HTML element class. So now up next, we want to get with web components, you can send in properties and attributes. And so we want to be able to observe any changes on an attribute. So we do that by getting observed attributes and returning an array of the different attributes that we would like to kind of keep track of. And then, of course, with classes, you need to have your constructor, and we have the super, which gets all the HTML element goodness, so like methods and properties. And then we clone the template so we can use it. So this is where we're like, we tell the browser, like, hey, you know that template I asked you to hold? Let me get that because I'm about to do something with it. And so we're cloning it. And then we're going to create a shadow DOM. And so this .attach shadow creates the shadow DOM inside of your web component. And there's a mode option, and it's either open or closed. And that is saying that should the shadow root's internal features be accessible via JavaScript. And so like when we were setting the guest attributes. And for most of what I've seen, open is kind of like the way you would go 90% of the time, unless you really want to lock in all the different things inside of your web component and not let anything reach into it. And then here, we're actually going to append the template to the shadow root. And now notice it says shadow root, not like document or anything, but shadow root, again, is your shadow DOM inside of your web component. And then I wanted to show that you can add event listeners to your web component. And so I have a click event listener right here, and it changes the color to red, the font color. All righty, cool. Further down into the class. Now, anyone familiar with different front-end frameworks such as React and Angular, or pretty much any of them, you may be familiar with the life cycle and of your components. And so again, this is web standards. So of course, web components are going to have them as well. And so the first one is the connected callback. And now that's invoked each time your custom element is appended to the DOM. And they can be called multiple times because you can have multiple instances of your web component inside of a page or an application. And so every time that it's added, this is called. So one for each time that it shows up. And then you can see, again, console logs are amazing. And we're setting the style color to blue. So the fonts start out for blue. Now, another attribute is whenever one of the observed attributes that we set earlier changes, this attribute change callback is called. And so it passes in the name, the old value, and the new value. So it knows those things. And so right here, again, console log. So I'm console logging the name of the attribute and the new value. And I'm checking to see if the new value is just a blank space, then I just set the verdict element to just empty. And then, so also I'm setting, so again, notice that it's this dot shadow root dot query selector, as opposed to what some people may be familiar with, like this dot document. And so again, we're working in the shadow DOM of our web component. And just like with in the light DOM, we can do query selectors or query select all or query select by ID or whatever, query select by class, whatever fits your fancy, you can do it here. And so I'm setting the inner text to be nothing. Now, if you answer, of course, the right answer, outcast, then I set the H1 tag to be all uppercase and with a bunch of exclamation points. And I set the verdict to you're right, because there's only one true answer. And I also dispatch a new custom event. And so, like I said, with the Shadow DOM API, we're able to kind of remap events. And so I'm sending off, once the verdict has been in, I'm sending off whether or not it's right or wrong. And so so you see here, guess. So I'm dispatching the event. It's a new custom event, naming it guest, and the detail is the message that you kind of send along with it. So, yep. And bubbles, it's either true or false. It's a Boolean. And so that says, do you want your event to bubble up through the component? So if you're, because you can have like multiple levels of your web component. And so if you want it to be able to bubble up through that, you can by setting that to true. And then if you set composed, another Boolean to true, it allows the event to cross into the light DOM. So you have an option of, if you want the outside code to know that an event has happened, and that's through the composed option. All right. Now here's the rest of that attribute called callback, attribute change callback, and it's just for if you choose any other group, which of course is wrong. And it's pretty much the same thing. We're getting a reference to the inner text of the H1, the verdict, and we're dispatching another custom event. All right, great. So now we've gone through the connected callback when your web component is added to the page. Then we also have when an attribute on your web component has changed. Now the disconnected callback is called when your custom element is disconnected or removed from the page. Now, this is useful just in general that let's say you have event listeners, you'd want to remove those. And especially if you have like timers or intervals, because if you don't remove them, then you at a risk of actually causing memory leaks. So by having your disconnected callback and removing them, you're also helping to prevent memory leaks. So cool. All right, now this is the final part of the JavaScript. And as you can see, it has to do with the custom elements API. And this is where we're taking what we want to name our custom element and the behavior we want to have it when your browser runs into it. And so we're just running custom elements.define, the name of the element, and the class that describes its behavior. All right. Cool. So now, like I said before, sometimes if that seems like a lot of boilerplate code to you, you're not alone. As web components do more, they tend to become quite complex and cumbersome to handle. So tools have been developed to help with building web components. And I found this site, webcomponents.dev, that's kind of like an online playground to be able to try different tools without too much investment on your part. And so, as you can see right here, they also do some pretty cool stuff like WebAssembly and things, but we're talking about focus on custom elements. So if you select that, you can see they offer a lot of different options to be able to create custom elements or web components. And funny enough, I have a upcoming blog post about where we compare some of these tools and, just kind of compare them. And I wrote a blog post about it. Now, let's talk about how we plan to use web components at Vonage. And just as we saw with the EA, we would like to create kind of like a design system of components. Now, the main goal would be for you to be able to get an application up and running faster. And you let us handle like the communication parts of your application so you can focus on the overall logic. And so for these components, we want to be able to be used within or without whatever framework or library that you're using now, or even in the future. Because again, with web components, they're web standards. That's the key phrase. And they're pretty much future-proof because they're built in to the web. All right. So now, here is an example of a very early super beta web component that I'm thinking of creating. So let's say you want to have a dial pad for maybe to enter in a security code or to call a phone number or dial up somebody's apartment. Whatever you want it to do, you're allowed to do it, except you don't have to worry now about how am I going to attach event listeners to buttons, or how do I worry about the layouts and all those other things. They're already ready for you in the actual web component. So all you would eventually be able to do is just put Vonage Dialer in your code, along with a couple of scripts that help the browser know what to do with your web component once it runs into it. And then you'll just have a nice little you can just enter in, which is kind of, I think, super cool. And then we have this dial button, which you can actually, there's on the attributes, because I set 2 false attributes for the hashtag and the star symbol. So that's why they're not showing up, but normally they would show up here. And so you'd be able to customize, just like with EA did with theirs, you'd be able to customize certain aspects of it. And then we'll have custom events. So each time I dialed a number, it sent a digit added custom event to the outside code, and then that added it to the input. And so you're not seeing it right now, but I have an alert that pops up saying dialing the number that I entered, connect call, okay for yes, cancel for no. So I'm going to hit okay. And then you can see it says that you now have the option of hanging up. So this is just a real rough kind of thing that we're looking into building with web components. So hopefully, you think that's cool. Right. Next. Now, you may be asking about browser support. Again, web standard. So modern browsers support it. And if you're supporting an older browser that may not support it, there's polyfills. Again, you can find more information at webcomponents.org, a really great source. And cool. So now in summary, there's 2 things, if anything, that you get from this talk today. One, that web components are kind of like your own little black box where you're able to put all the things that you want into it without having to worry about exposing anything to the outside world or the light DOM. And so you pass in properties and attributes, react to them, and then if you want to, send a custom event out to the light DOM and to let it know that something has happened. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would like you to take from this talk is that Outcast is the greatest group of all time. Just wanted to say that. Okay, now I want to kind of do some selfish, shameless plugs. So my website, lifelong.dev, I've actually been creating web components for my own personal use. And so if you can, on my website, lifelong.dev, you can see here, this currently at home in Orlando, Florida, check out, Dwayne.in, that is an actual web component. And I wanted to have something because I created a whole nother website that's kind of like where I can chronicle my adventures as a developer advocate and being able to travel, or used to be able to travel. And so I have some of the different conferences I was able to go to. And so I wanted to be able to have some sort of indicator on my website, my main website, that, hey, maybe I'm in your town. So this is updated from the actual other site. So instead of having to go back to this site and updating it every time, I just update my other site, which I'm going to do anyway, and it updates automatically here, which I thought was pretty useful. And so that's the Dwayne-in. Next. Now, I like to create random projects, and I think that helped me get my developer advocate job here at Vonage. And so one of them was a tic-tac-toe game using React. So it's called Tic React Toe. And recently we had an internal hackathon. And so I was able to recreate the Tic React Toe game using Vonage APIs. So it's basically a tic-tac-toe game, but with video chat. And so you're video chatting with a person while you're playing tic-tac-toe. And so I thought that was pretty cool. And using all of the Vonage APIs. Now, that's not has anything to do with the web components, but if you scroll up, I wanted to have something when I create side projects that I'll have a section that I could reuse every time that will tell me or tell the user, whoever stumbles across my site, more about the actual project, what it was built with, any updates, and for more information, you can check out my actual website. And so instead of, much like EA, I don't want to have to, every time I create a new side project, I have to go and recreate this information. So web components are a perfect use for that. And so the actual about, built with, and the updates are all called from an API call from the individual side project site, and it populates there. And so I have it set up to where each one of my side project sites are actually using the latest version of the Dwayne-made web component, so that when I update the actual web component, it updates across all of them. Now you can actually, if you would like, version the difference. So if you want to kind of keep a certain web component at a certain version while you work on another one, that's totally possible as well. And so it's very versatile as that. But I wanted to be able to just update once, update everywhere. And so if you want to check it out, ticreacttoe.com, maybe play tic-tac-toe with someone you haven't spoken with in a while or seen for a minute. And so there's that. Now, I want to thank you for coming in and watching me talk about web components and kind of geeking out a little bit about it. And as I mentioned before, I've been writing blog posts about web components on the Vonage blog. So if you want to check them out, you can go to, it's kind of a long URL. So dwayne.in/Vonage will take you to my author page on the Vonage blog. And so I'm really big into feedback. So let me know if you think of anything, later on, but not here right now, that you'd like to ask. Please feel free to leave a comment or what have you in the blog post. And so my goal is, like Lorna said, is to make this year, well, no, scratch 2020, because 2020 has been pretty trash. So we're just going to throw that away. So hopefully we together can make 2021 the year of web components. And yeah, so thank you very much. And that's it. Any questions or anything anyone may have?
Dwayne, you never fail to inform and educate me and all of us. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. So I'm going to try and represent the audience and pass on their questions to you while I have you here on screen.
Awesome. I have nothing. I have nowhere else to be. I will be here all day.
I'm sorry, you can't be on stage all day. We have other speakers to fit
in. No, nobody wants that. Believe me. No one more than me. So
okay.
I am sweating.
So we'll start with this first question. Now, this one came from Maeve, and it says, I'm new to coding. I'm about to take my HTML exam soon and then study CSS. what are some tips you can give on entering a future career in web dev? Now, you, lifelong dev, are the perfect person to answer this. So what advice do you think?
For me, whenever anyone asks me a question like that, I just have to say, be prepared to be frustrated. Like, just be very cool being frustrated. Just understand, oh, who is calling me? Oh, that's not good. Sanford and Son. All right. So be very cool with being frustrated. Understand that you're not going to know everything because there's so much to learn. Just be cool with understanding that you will get through it. Like a great philosopher, Jay-Z once said, difficult takes a day, impossible takes a week. So as long as you're just, going little by little at it, you will just have faith in yourself that you will be able to accomplish it, and you will. And if not, ask for help. Sometimes I feel like coders are almost like typecasted as being like loners and things, and just kind of by ourselves, where for me, it's been a very communal experience. I like going to meetups and speaking with people and picking brains and being able to give talks. And I do a bunch of different like lightning talks. And so just to kind of like, hey, I'm into this. Are you into this? Let's talk together and, maybe do something. So if you're doing HTML, CSS, like try to understand as much as you can, but knowing that you're not going to know everything, but know enough to where you can get something done and then build on top of that.
That's really good advice. Very good. Yeah, I
tend to ramble.
I am. Yeah, that works. And good luck in your HTML exam soon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Crush
okay. So next up, we've got a question. What's your favorite tool for building web components?
Ooh, so that's a thing that we're going to talk about in the next blog post. So I don't want to give away too much.
Can we have a little hint?
It begins with S. Oh. And so the one I've actually been using is called Stencil, and it's made by the good folks at the Ionic framework. So they decided to kind of build their own tool since they were because they relied on Angular for a long time for their components. And so they're like, well, instead of relying on Angular or another framework, let's just build our own web component tools that can be used anywhere. And so they did that and released the tool, and it's called Stencil.
Okay.
You can get it at stencilgm.com.
And we'll look out for the blog post, which is going to show up on that feed that you just shared. Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, next up, I want to ask, can we use web components in any front-end JavaScript framework? Or does a component need anything special to be used? If we want to use it with React or with Vue, how does that look?
Well, if you go to webcomponents.org, is it webcomponents.org? I have the links in the blog post where it actually will tell you because again, frameworks are very opinionated. And so certain frameworks handle things differently. So there's a website actually called custom-elements-everywhere.com. Again, it's in the blog post. And it will break down all the different frameworks because there seems to be a million of them. Just keep coming out. And with that, you're able to see, like, they give them scores and they run tests and they tell you how many tests they pass and how to kind of get around them. And so, again, it's in the blog post if you want to check that out. But yeah, so for a majority of especially now that web components are becoming more and more of a thing, a lot of the frameworks are like, all right, this is the thing. We're just going to implement it and make it work out of the box. So
yeah, and so do you think it's more common to do it that way? Or the next question is, does anyone really use vanilla web components like you showed?
There is actually a whole GitHub repository of people really championing vanilla JavaScript web components. And it's, as with anything in coding, the answer is pretty much it depends. It really depends on what you want to do. And if you find it easier to use vanilla web components. Now, if you're on a team and you're all working on a bunch of different components and they get kind of complex, you might find it easier to use a tool. And so that's why webcomponents.dev is a pretty cool site, because you can just spin up a web component using one of the many tools and see if it fits what you like. Like there's one, and it's in the blog post that's coming soon, but there's actually a tool. If you're a big fan of functional programming, you can build web components using functional programming. So there's something for everyone.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got some choices. And now a question about the platform. So how do web components work if JavaScript is turned off?
So with Stencil, there's actually an option to be able to server-side render your web components. So you can use that as an option. So it comes down from your server as just everything that you need. So it will render what you have, but being able to interact with it probably won't happen. And so since you need JavaScript for that.
Okay.
So there's options.
Oh, it's good to know there's options. That isn't the answer I was expecting. So I've learned so much already. Okay. And for new developers, how friendly is it for someone like that to jump into web components compared to a fully fledged framework? Like, would you give advice for one or the other?
I would think I would try to get to the level where if you see a class object, you understand what's happening there. And so as far as that JavaScript, and building web components, I think will make you a better developer because, again, it's web standard. So you're going to see it at some point. And if you're using frameworks, you will come across them as well because they're using pretty much the same thing. It's just that now the web has kind of caught up and now understands. Instead of using a framework to create your own components, you can now do that. And a lot of the tools, like Stencil, it allows you to create an app using just web components. And so there's plenty of options. So now, did I answer the question? I don't think I answered the question. So if you're new to it, I would say try to get to where the things that I showed today, they're not that like new or odd or different to you. Get used to that, and then I believe you'll be able to kind of understand and grasp more of the other things.
Yeah, and what I hear you saying there is you're going to come across the web components, and it's good to have a clear grounding before you apply them in frameworks. I think that's really nice advice.
Try to understand the fundamentals as much as you possibly can.
Okay. So,
you don't have to be an expert, but just try to understand it.
Yeah. Okay. No, I like that. So you have more questions, and we're just gonna try and rattle through the last couple, maybe before we go to a break. But so the question is, what blog post are you currently writing or planning to write on web components?
So I just submitted I'm horrible at writing blog posts, by the way. I can talk about them all day, but just somehow sitting down and trying to distill all that into a blog post is difficult for me. So we've got the tools coming up. So the general overview is up now. We've got the tool comparison coming up. I'm going to show how to build one using the tool that was chosen, which is Stencil. And then we're going to show how you can use that, like again, with or without a framework. So we're going to have one just vanilla, one that's a blog post with React, Angular, Vue, and whatever else probably will come out by the time that happens. And then maybe go into design systems where you take a bunch of web components and put them all together. And so, yeah, that's the plan.
All right. And that's all going to be on the Vonage blog, right? So people should just watch out for that. Excellent news. All right. I'm going to fire in one.
And please leave comments. Leave comments because I'm a big fan of
Leave comments. Feedback. I guess if you want to request blog post topics, Dwayne's on fire with his writing now. So you just go ahead and comment in chat and we'll give him a list.
Oh, yeah. Give me like 4 years to put it together. Cool.
Perfect. I don't see what the rush could be. And I'm going to fire in one very last question, which is we're being asked, is there a site that lists web components that we can use like in our own project?
Yes. Again, in the blog posts, I have a bunch of different resources, but webcomponents.org is a really good site to start off with. And from there, you can find other places because they list different tools and a lot of things. So it's a really good place to start. Let's see. Well, there's a new one that I think Google's behind, or people from Google. There's open-wc.org.
Okay.
And that has some information. But webcomponents.org is a really good place to start. That comes off.
That is
again
fantastic. Dwayne, thank you so much, and thanks for taking the time to answer the questions. This has been illuminating.